Let's talk through some equivalent form of numbers. So we're talking about fractions, decimals, percents, just different types of ratios. So first things first, when you look at this busy screen, all of these are equal, right? 12/15, 4/5, those reduce to be the same. Change it to a decimal and you get 0.8. Write it as a ratio with a colon, you get 4:5. Change it to a percent, it's 80%. Use the word 2 as a ratio, 40/50, and also as a scaled up fraction, 800/1000. There's a lot of different ways to write the same numbers. So first things first, let's reduce fractions. When I'm looking at 28/42, my first thing that I see is that they both, numerator and denominator, are reducible by 7. If I divide the top by 7, I get 4. If I divide the bottom by 7, I get 6. Well, both of those are even, so I would end up with 2/3. This original fraction by 14. Now let's go to number 2, 45/60. Now you might say, well, based off the 5 and 0, they're reducible by 5. Absolutely true. I see that they're both reducible by 15. So I end up with 3/4. If you start by reducing by 5, great. You would get 9/12, and then that would reduce to 3/4. And 7/13, well, they share no common factors, so that is already reduced. So there's your reducing fractions. Now let's convert fractions to decimals. So remember, if you have a fraction, to change it to a decimal, we take the top divided by the bottom. Or it might look like this. If you're using a calculator, you're going to type in the top number, the division button, or maybe this button, and then a 4. Okay? So let's do that. Convert the following fractions to decimals and round to 3 places. So we're going to take 28 divided by 42, and we end up with 0.66666, and it goes on and on and on. So rounding to 3 decimal places, we look at the 6. 6 tells me to round up, so that's 0.667. Next one, 24/36. When I divide that, I get the same thing. That's also 2/3. So again, a 0.667. And then last but not least, when I take 45 divided by 60, it comes out nicely as 0.75. Let's do a couple more of those. 7 divided by 13. Hopefully when you're watching these videos, you're going to maybe pause, try these on your own, and see how they go. So 7 divided by 13 gives me kind of an ugly decimal. So I just write it out here a little bit. But we're still rounding to 3 decimal places. So 8 is in the 3rd place. I look at 4. 4 tells me to round down. So that rounds to 538 thousandths. When I take 75 and I divide by 125, it comes out nicely to just 0.6. And when I take 16 divided by 18, I get 0.88888, and it keeps going. So again, when I want to go to 3 decimal places, 8 tells me to round up, so 0.889. Okay, now let's talk about scaling. When we change a number to a decimal, that's like saying it's over 1, right? So if I have like 0.6, I can put that over 1. So then if I wanted this to be per 10, I would just multiply the top by 10. Okay, that's the idea of this. So if I'm looking at 29/100, I can change that to a decimal, first of all. Wait a minute, I don't want it to be 29. I wanted it to be 20. If I make it 20/100, as a decimal, that's 0.2. And you can get that by dividing if you don't know that one. And that's like saying I have 0.2/1. So now if I multiply this by 10, I would get 2/10. And you might say, well, I can just reduce that first fraction. Of course you can. We're talking about process here. Now for the second one, 3/8. If I take 3 divided by 8 and get 0.375, it's like saying over 1. If I multiply the top and bottom by 10, I get 3.75/10. Right? We're talking about scaling here, which can be a very important factor in the math world. Now in number 12, we already have a decimal, so we multiply by 10 and we get 7.9/10. Let's go to these where we're going to go per 1,000. So same idea is that when I take 6 divided by 25, I get 0.24. Now that's like saying 0.24 over 1. So when I multiply the top and the bottom by 1,000, I get 240 over 1,000. In 14, we already have a decimal. So I just multiply the top and the bottom by 1,000, and I get 321 over 1,000. In number 15, when I divide those, I get 1.5. So when I multiply the top and the bottom by 1,000, I get 1,500 over 1,000. Scaling can be very important when you get into ratios and like trying to make meaning out of some difficult data. So now let's convert fractions and decimals to percentages. Here is the key. If we have a decimal already, let's just say we have 34 hundredths. That is like saying, this is over 1, but percent means out of 100. So if we multiply this by 100, I get 34, and that represents 34%. Okay, so it's out of 100 is what percent means. Now, if we start with a fraction, we can start by changing that to a decimal, then multiply by 100, and we would get 50%. Okay, so if I say I have 20 over 100, now here's an easy one. If it's already out of 100, then we know that is 20%. If that's not clear to you, that's fine. 20 over 100 is the same as 0.2. If I multiply 0.2 by 100, there's my 20%. 0.86, it's a decimal, so I can multiply by 100, and that just leaves me with 86%. And then when I have 2 over 2,500, when I divide 2 divided by 2,500, I get 0.0008. Now, if I multiply that by 100, I end up with 0.08%. So that's a very small percentage, but this process doesn't change. You'll also notice that when I'm multiplying by 100, it's really just moving the decimal over 2 places. It's the same idea because 100 has 2 zeros, which represents 2 decimal places. Let's do a couple more of these. 25 over 20 changes to the decimal of 1.25. If I want to make that a percentage, I multiply by 100 or move the decimal 2 places, and I have 125%. With 7 over 13, that's 0.538461, goes on and on. If I multiply that by 100 and move the decimal over, I get 53.84615%. So if we want to round to the nearest tenth of a percent, that's here. You change to percent first, then you round. 4 tells me to round down, and I get 53.8%. Last but not least, 0.095, I can multiply by 100 or move the decimal 2 places, and I get 9.5%. Last but not least, converting percentages to decimals. Now, we're just going the other way. So if I have 57%, right, to change to a percent, we multiply by 100. To change out of a percent, we divide by 100. So that's the easy way to make it a fraction. You can divide this with your calculator, but the same idea, you're going to end up moving your decimal. So if we have 36%, we're going to divide by 100, which moves the decimal left, and we end up with 0.36. So let's do a couple of these. 86%, divide by 100, locate the decimal, 2 places to the left, 0.86. 115%, locate the decimal. We're dividing by 100, so we move the decimal left 2 places, and we get 1.15. 5%, locate the decimal. We're dividing by 100, so left 2 places, and we get 0.05. Let's do just 3 more. 25.3%, locate the decimal 2 places to the left because we're dividing by 100, and we get 0.253. 26, locate the decimal 2 places to the left. you'll notice that I have a decimal point and then a blank spot. That blank spot is filled in by a 0. So I have 0.00035 as a decimal. And the last one, 1.8%. Locate the decimal. Move it 2 places. Again, we have a blank spot, so we fill it in with a 0, and we have 0.018. And that is playing with equivalent forms of numbers.